Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones hiding in plain sight. In 1980, Carol Bundy seemed like an ordinary woman, a nurse who lived in Los Angeles. But beneath her everyday appearance was a life shaped by trauma, manipulation, and unimaginable darkness. When she met Doug Clark, a charming yet deeply disturbed man, their relationship would lead to one of the most chilling killing sprees the city had ever seen. And in a twisted confession that left investigators stunned, Carol revealed details so grotesque they hardly seemed real, like the time she put lipstick and makeup on a decapitated head for her boyfriend to enjoy. But to truly understand the horror they unleashed, we need to look at how their childhoods shaped the monsters they became. Carol Bundy was born in 1942 in Oregon, but from the start her life was anything but normal. By the age of 11, Carol's mother had passed away, and her father, an abusive alcoholic, was all she had left. He often beat her and subjected her to SA, and there was no one around to protect her. After her mother's death, Carol was thrust into a harsh world where abuse was all she knew. By the time Carol was a teenager, the trauma of her childhood had already scarred her deeply. She struggled academically and socially, constantly seeking love and validation in all the wrong places. The constant cycle of neglect and abuse caused Carol to suffer from low self-esteem, and she started to associate love with submission and pain. As Carol moved into adulthood, her life didn't get any easier. She bounced from one abusive relationship to another, always ending up with men who took advantage of her vulnerable emotional state. She had 2 failed marriages and 2 sons, but she struggled to take care of herself, let alone her children. Eventually, her kids were taken away from her, compounding her feelings of worthlessness. Despite all this, Carol managed to hold down a job as a nurse in Los Angeles. Her outward appearance, a woman working in healthcare, helping people, was a stark contrast to the turmoil she carried inside. Desperate for love and constantly in search of someone to fill the emotional void, Carol's life was a cocktail of trauma and loneliness, just waiting for a spark to ignite her darkest impulses. On the surface, Doug Clark appeared to be everything Carol Bundy wasn't: confident, charismatic, and in control. But much like Carol, Doug's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction. Born in 1948 in Pennsylvania, Doug was raised in a military family. His father, a naval officer, moved the family around frequently, which made Doug's childhood feel unstable. Doug's father was also domineering and emotionally distant, which may have influenced Doug's later need for control and dominance over others. Doug's adolescent years gave some early hints of his darker tendencies. While his outward charm earned him popularity among his peers, beneath that charm was a boy with increasingly sadistic desires. By the time he was a teenager, Doug had developed fantasies involving violence and control over women. He was reportedly obsessed with pornography and had an interest in violent behavior, a disturbing combination that would later fuel his crimes. Despite these warning signs, Doug appeared to lead a relatively successful life. He served in the military, traveled around the world, and seemed to blend into society with ease. But inside, Doug's darker desires were festering. He held various jobs when he returned to the United States, but it was during this time while working as a mechanic that he met Carol Bundy, and together they would feed each other's worst impulses. A deadly match. In 1980, when Doug Clark and Carol Bundy crossed paths, it was like a perfect storm. Carol, desperate for love and approval, was instantly drawn to Doug's confidence and charm. And Doug, always on the lookout for someone he could control and manipulate, saw Carol as the perfect partner in crime. The relationship quickly became toxic. Doug would share his violent fantasies with Carol, fantasies that involved kidnapping, torturing, and killing young women. Rather than being repulsed, Carol was captivated. Years of trauma had left her emotionally malleable, and Doug's attention was intoxicating. She would do anything to keep him happy, even if it meant participating in the unthinkable. Soon enough, Doug's fantasies became reality. Between June and August 1980, the couple embarked on a spree of brutal murders, preying on young women and sex workers along the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. Doug would lure the women into his car, using Carol's everyday, almost motherly appearance as a decoy to gain the unsuspecting victim's trust. they would take them to secluded areas and shoot them in the head. Carol, who initially stayed on the sidelines, was soon drawn deeper into the violence. Doug had very twisted fantasies that he acted out upon the women they abducted, often photographing them after they were no longer alive, and even worse crimes that involved necrophilia, adding a layer of depravity to the already brutal and senseless crimes. One of the most horrific moments in their spree came when Doug murdered a young runaway named Exie Wilson. After killing her, Doug decapitated Exie's body and brought her severed head back to Carol's apartment. For most people, this would be an unimaginable horror. But for Carol, this was an opportunity to show Doug just how far she was willing to go for him. Carol took Exie's head and cleaned it up. Then, in a chilling act of devotion, she applied makeup and lipstick to the severed head daily after retrieving it from the freezer, where she kept it to keep it preserved as possible. She even styled the hair, creating a grotesque display for Doug's twisted enjoyment. In a later interview, Carol would describe this event with an eerie calm, as if it were nothing more than a casual chore. She was quoted as saying, "You know it's a real bitch putting lipstick on a frozen head," when discussing this with a detective. She had become fully enmeshed in Doug's world of sadism, willing to do whatever it took to prove her loyalty. While Carol had largely been an accomplice to Doug's killings, she eventually crossed the line into murder herself. Carol had developed a relationship with Jack Murray, a country singer she met at a bar where she worked part-time. At some point, Carol confided in Jack about Doug's violent crimes, perhaps as a way to unburden herself or seek validation. But as Jack grew suspicious and began talking about going to the police, Carol feared that her entire world would come crashing down. She lured Jack into a van under the pretense of intimacy and shot him in the head before decapitating him. This was another time her eerie, nonchalant attitude towards gruesome acts would be on full display. When talking with the detective, she said something to the effect of, "Hey, I brought Jack with me," saying this to Doug. She had a bag over her shoulder that contained Jack's decapitated head. When she showed this to Doug, she said, "Oh," and we both just laughed and laughed, as if it was a harmless, humorous practical joke instead of a horrific act of depravity. This statement, along with her genuine laughter in the moment as she was telling the story, sent shivers down the detective's spine. It's something he said he will never forget. Carol, while appearing harmless and even almost motherly, obviously held within her a very troubled and dark mind. The once timid nurse who had spent her life being abused had now fully transformed into a killer in her own right. Days after Jack's murder, Carol's mental state began to unravel. The weight of her crimes, along with her fear of Doug turning on her, pushed her to the breaking point. She walked into a police station and made a confession that would leave even seasoned investigators horrified. Carol calmly recounted how she had helped Doug in his murder spree, how she dressed up Exie Wilson's severed head, and how she had murdered Jack Murray. Her tone, casual and matter-of-fact, made the gruesome details of her confession even more unsettling. Investigators struggled to comprehend how someone who had once been a nurse, someone whose job was to save lives, could be so deeply involved in such horrific acts. Carol's co-workers were left shocked that the timid nurse they worked with was actually capable of these crimes. Sure, she was a little different, perhaps a bit of a closed book, but never would they have imagined she was a cold-blooded murderer. Doug Clark was quickly arrested after Carol's confession, and both were charged with multiple counts of murder. At trial, Doug attempted to distance himself from the crimes, pinning much of the blame on Carol and eventually opting to act as his own attorney, which proved to be a poorly thought-out move on his part. The evidence against him, especially Carol's damning testimony, was overwhelming. Doug Clark was convicted and sentenced to death, where he remains on death row today. Carol Bundy, in exchange for her cooperation, avoided the death penalty, but was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She died behind bars in 2003 from heart failure. The case of Carol Bundy and Doug Clark is one of the darkest chapters in Los Angeles history, a tale of two deeply damaged individuals whose paths collided in the most gruesome way possible. Carol's troubled past set the stage for her susceptibility to Doug's manipulation, and together, they unleashed a reign of terror that left investigators and the public alike shocked by their depravity. In the end, Carol Bundy wasn't just a victim of her circumstances or Doug's influence. She became an active participant in murder and mutilation, her need for love and approval driving her to commit unthinkable acts. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the crimes themselves, but the casual, almost nonchalant way Carol described them in her confession. It's a chilling example of how far someone can descend into darkness when their entire life has been shaped by violence and control.
In 1968, Martinsville, Indiana, was more than just a small town. It was a known sundown town, a place where black people were unwelcome after dark. For Carol Jenkins, a 20-year-old black woman, stepping into this hostile environment would prove to be a fatal decision. This is her story. Carol was born in 1947 to Elizabeth Jenkins in Franklin, Indiana. After her parents' divorce, her mother married Paul Davis, a local factory worker in nearby Rushville. Paul raised Carol as his own while he and Elizabeth went on to have 5 more children. Carol became the beloved big sister, someone the younger kids looked up to. Carol had dreams, big dreams. As a teenager, she wanted to move to Chicago and become a model. But life had other plans. In 1965, she graduated from Rushville High School and got a job at the Ford Motor Company's Philco plant. When a union strike shut down the plant, Carol looked for other work. That's when she took a job selling encyclopedias door-to-door for colliers. It was a way to make ends meet, but it would lead her into a nightmare. On September 16, 1968, Carol set out on her first day selling encyclopedias. Dressed in a white turtleneck, olive green pants, and a bright yellow scarf, she volunteered to go to Martinsville, a decision that would forever change her life. Martinsville was known to be a sundown town, but Carol believed she would be safe. After all, she was traveling with 3 co-workers, 2 white men, and a 19-year-old black woman. But as the day went on, Carol found herself alone, walking through the streets of a town where she wasn't welcome. For those unfamiliar, a sundown town was an all-too-common part of America's history. These towns, prevalent through much of the 20th century, had unspoken and sometimes very explicit rules. Black people could not be within city limits after sundown. Signs would even be posted at the town's borders, sending a clear and sinister message. The threat was very real. If you were black and caught in these towns after dark, you were in serious danger. As she made her rounds, a car began following her. Inside were 2 white men, who hurled racial slurs at her, catcalling and intimidating her. Fearing for her safety, Carol approached a nearby home and knocked on the door. It was the home of Don and Norma Neal, a young white couple. When Carol asked for help, saying, "Please let me in, I've got somebody following me," they didn't hesitate to let her in. The Neals called the police, and officers eventually found 2 men who admitted to following Carol, but nothing came of it. Norma, concerned for Carol, walked several blocks with her, searching for her co-workers. When they couldn't find them, Norma offered to let Carol stay with them for the night. But Carol, not wanting to cause any trouble, declined. She believed the worst was behind her and headed to the rendezvous point where she was supposed to meet her co-workers. But the danger hadn't passed. About 15 to 30 minutes later, the 2 men returned. This time, they weren't just following her. They were hunting her. One man grabbed Carol, holding her arms back, while the other stabbed her in the chest with a screwdriver. The men left her bleeding in the street where she died, alone and terrified. Carol's murder devastated her family. Her father, Paul Davis, was adamant that because Martinsville was a sundown town with a history of racism, the police weren't taking her case seriously. He even demanded that the FBI step in, but the local authorities refused. The case went cold, and for 33 long years, Carol's family was left with no answers. Then, in June 2000, a breakthrough. Carol's mother, Elizabeth, received an anonymous phone call. The caller revealed the name of the killer. Elizabeth immediately told Paul, who dipped into his retirement savings to hire a private investigator. Soon, the Indiana State Police took notice and assigned cold case investigators to look into Carol's murder once again. In November 2001, the investigators received another anonymous tip, this time in the form of a letter. The letter named Kenneth C. Richmond as Carol's killer. Richmond was a 70-year-old career criminal with ties to extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. At the time of the murder, he had been passing through Martinsville with another man after a day of drinking. But there was more. Richmond's daughter Shirley, who was just 7 years old at the time, had been in the car that night. Shirley, now estranged from her father for more than 2 decades, came forward and corroborated the story. She told investigators that she had watched from the back seat as her father and another man chased Carol down and killed her. Shirley even described the exact clothes Carol was wearing that night, details never released to the public. The brutal truth was that after murdering Carol, Kenneth Richmond had turned to his young daughter and, laughing, said, "She got what she deserved." He then handed Shirley $7, one for each year of her life, to buy her silence. Kenneth C. Richmond, the man identified as Carol Jenkins's murderer, was arrested in May 2002 while living in an Indianapolis nursing home. At the time of his arrest, Richmond was 70 years old and suffering from various health issues, including mental decline, possibly linked to dementia. Richmond never faced trial for Carol Jenkins' murder. He was declared incompetent to stand trial, and just 2 weeks later, on August 31, 2002, he passed away from bladder cancer. The identity of the second man involved in Carol Jenkins's murder has never been conclusively determined. While Kenneth C. Richmond was identified as the man who stabbed Carol, his daughter Shirley McQueen, who witnessed the murder as a 7-year-old, stated that Richmond was not acting alone. She told investigators that another man was with her father that night, but his identity remains unknown. Though Richmond never served time for Carol's murder, his identification and arrest provided some closure for Carol's family, after more than 30 years of waiting for justice. In the aftermath of Jenkins' tragic death, Dawn and Norma Neal, who had bravely tried to help her, found themselves the target of relentless harassment and even death threats. Their simple act of kindness placed them in the crosshairs of those who refused to let go of their hate. Years later, in 2014, the Neals sought to honor Carol's memory by proposing a monument in Martinsville. But their efforts were halted when County Commissioner Norman Voiles admitted he had to abandon the plans after receiving significant backlash from the community. Despite the obstacles, Carol's memory was not forgotten. On November 1, 2017, a community park in Rushville, Indiana, was rededicated in her honor, now known as Carol Jenkins Davis Park. The following day, a memory stone was placed in the garden of Martinsville's City Hall, serving as a quiet but powerful tribute to the young woman whose life was cut short. Carol Jenkins' murder stands as a haunting reminder of the violent racism that plagued, and still haunts, many American towns. Her story, tragically silenced for years, now serves as a call for justice and remembrance for those who face prejudice and hate. Though justice came late, the memory of Carol Jenkins endures. Title: The Chilling Case of the Icebox Murders, 1965. In the quiet streets of Houston, Texas, nestled within a nondescript home, a horrifying discovery was about to send shockwaves through the community, a discovery that, to this day, remains unsolved. This is the story of the Icebox Murders, a case so chilling that it has baffled investigators for nearly 6 decades. The call for a welfare check. It's June 23, 1965. Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple living in a modest home at 1815 Driscoll Street, hadn't been seen by neighbors for several days. Concerned, a family member reached out to the Houston Police Department, requesting a welfare check. Fred Rogers, a 81-year-old man, and his 79-year-old wife Edwina lived quiet, reclusive lives, but their sudden disappearance from daily routine had neighbors and relatives on edge. When the officers knocked on the Rogers' door, there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. They had no choice but to force their way inside. What they found that day would not only defy imagination, it would lead to one of the most gruesome, unsolved mysteries in Texas history. The horrifying discovery. The house was ordinary, almost mundane at first glance. There were no immediate signs of struggle or forced entry. But something wasn't right. The house had an unnerving stillness. The officers continued their search, making their way to the kitchen, where they noticed the refrigerator door was slightly ajar. The faint hum of the appliance filled the silence, and when they opened it, They were greeted with what appeared to be packages of freshly cut meat, stacked neatly on the shelves. At first glance, the officers thought it might be pork or beef. But as they examined the contents closer, they realized the grisly truth. The meat wasn't from any animal. It was human remains, cut, dismembered, and wrapped in neat packages. The remains belonged to Fred and Edwina Rogers. Fred and Edwin's heads were later found in the vegetable drawer, eyes wide open in an eternal stare of horror. Edwina's organs had been removed and flushed down the toilet, and her body had been similarly dismembered. The entire scene was a nightmarish vision straight out of a horror movie. But perhaps most chilling of all, their killer had taken the time to carefully butcher and store their remains. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was methodical, and the more investigators uncovered, the more terrifying the case became. The immediate suspect, Charles Rogers. Charles Rogers, the son of Fred and Edwina, was a 43-year-old reclusive man who lived in the attic of the Rogers home. Neighbors rarely saw him, and those who did described him as odd, secretive, and distant. He communicated with his parents mainly through notes slipped under the door. Some didn't even know he lived there. When police searched the house, they noticed something odd. Charles was nowhere to be found. His room was clean and orderly, but there was no sign of him. In fact, it appeared as if he had vanished without a trace. Naturally, he became the prime suspect in the brutal murders. But who was Charles Rogers? And why would he have done something so horrific? Who was Charles Rogers? Charles Frederick Rogers was a highly intelligent man with a background in nuclear physics. He had served in World War II as a pilot and later worked for Shell Oil as a seismologist, a career that required significant intelligence and skill. But in the years leading up to the murders, Charles had become more withdrawn and erratic. He abruptly quit his job in the late 1950s and began to isolate himself from the outside world. Despite his reclusive nature, Charles was known for his obsession with ham radios, and he was fluent in several languages. He rarely left the house, though some neighbors claimed to see him coming and going at odd hours, often at dawn or dusk. What puzzled investigators was that a man as educated and capable as Charles could seemingly disappear without a trace. The crime scene and evidence. The police noted several strange details in the house. Despite the horrific scene in the kitchen, there was little blood found in the rest of the house. It seemed that whoever committed the murders had cleaned up carefully. The only traces of blood were found in the bathroom and the master bedroom, where it was believed the murders had taken place. Upon further investigation, they found a bloody saw in the attic, which seemed to confirm that Charles had dismembered his parents' bodies there. But without Charles himself, investigators were left with more questions than answers. Possible motive. The most accepted theory at the time was that Charles had a troubled relationship with his parents. Reports suggested that Fred and Edwina were controlling and abusive toward their son, possibly driving him to a breaking point. Some speculated that Fred may have financially exploited Charles, leading to resentment. Other reports suggest Edwina might have been involved in fraudulent financial schemes. But there were even darker theories. Some believed Charles was involved in covert government work, potentially espionage or intelligence operations. His knowledge of multiple languages and highly technical skills fed into the idea that he was more than just a reclusive genius. Could this have played a role in the murders? Or was it simply a case of long-buried family tensions exploding into violence? The disappearance of Charles Rogers. Despite being the prime suspect, Charles Rogers was never found. It's as if he vanished into thin air. Some believed he had fled the country, perhaps using his skills and intelligence connections to disappear without a trace. Others speculated that he was murdered by someone else, and that his body was hidden to cover up a larger conspiracy. There were occasional sightings of Charles reported over the years, but none were ever confirmed. Investigators chased leads across the globe, but nothing concrete ever materialized. The case eventually went cold, with no sign of the elusive Charles Rogers. Theories and speculation. As the years went on, the case of the Icebox murders became a magnet for conspiracy theories. One theory suggested that Charles was involved in the JFK assassination, linking him to shady intelligence operatives. Another suggested that his parents may have been involved in criminal activities, such as money laundering or fraud, and that their deaths were the result of a business deal gone wrong. Others speculated that Charles was a victim of mental illness, pushed to the brink by years of abuse and isolation. The fact that he disappeared so completely only fueled these theories. The legacy of the Icebox murders. To this day, the Icebox murders remain one of the most baffling and gruesome cold cases in American history. No one knows what truly happened in that Houston home in 1965, or where Charles Rogers went after his parents' brutal deaths. The mystery of his disappearance continues to haunt investigators, with some believing he may still be out there, living under a new identity. The house on Driscoll Street was eventually torn down, but the ghost of the crime still lingers in Houston's collective memory. The story of Fred and Edwina Rogers, once ordinary elderly residents, has become a gruesome legend, one that continues to terrify and mystify those who dare to look into the case. As for Charles Rogers, he remains a ghost, his existence a mere shadow on the edge of one of the most chilling unsolved murders in history. Will we ever know the truth about the Icebox murders? Or is it destined to remain an unsolvable enigma, forever frozen in time? The case I'm discussing in today's video is one of the most heartbreaking and horrific stories I have ever heard. The victim was a young, bright, beautiful teenage girl. Her life was just beginning when it was cruelly taken by 4 teenage boys whose callous actions and depraved minds shocked Japan and the entire world when the story went public. This is a difficult case to hear, so viewer discretion is advised. The Junko Furuta case is one of the most shocking and horrific crimes in modern history. It's a story of unimaginable cruelty, where a young girl endured 44 days of torment, ultimately losing her life in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. Despite the darkness, it's important to tell her story and remember her as more than just a victim, but as a person whose life was tragically cut short. Junko Furuta was a bright and popular 17-year-old high school student living in Misato, Saitama Prefecture, Japan. She had a promising future ahead of her, working part-time and focusing on her studies. But on November 25, 1988, her life took a terrifying turn. As Junko was riding her bike home from her job, she caught the attention of Hiroshi Miyano, a teenage delinquent with ties to the Yakuza, Japan's organized crime syndicate. Miyano and his group of friends, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, were actively seeking a girl to abduct for their own sick amusement. Miyano knocked Junko off her bike and pretended to help her as if he were a good Samaritan, but this was a trap. He led her to an isolated location where his friends were waiting. They kidnapped her and took her to Minato's family home, where they held her captive. What followed over the next 44 days was a nightmare beyond words. Junko was tortured in ways that are unimaginable, as her captors subjected her to repeated physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They starved her, beat her, and burned her with cigarettes. Her legs were set on fire, her skin was mutilated, and her body was treated like an object. These boys even invited other individuals to join in the abuse. Junko's suffering was relentless, and her pleas for help went unheard. Minato's family, who lived in the same house where she was imprisoned, knew about her presence but chose to remain silent, either out of fear of Miyano's Yakuza connections or out of complete indifference. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is how these boys manipulated her into calling her family, convincing them that she had run away and was safe, which prevented any immediate search for her. While Junko was being tortured in unimaginable ways. By January 4th, 1989, Junko's body had endured all it could. She succumbed to her injuries after more than a month of torture. The boys, realizing she was dead, stuffed her body into a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and disposed of it at a construction site. The crime could have gone unnoticed for longer, but Hiroshi Miyano, already under suspicion for unrelated offenses, made a careless confession during a police interrogation. His words opened the door to Junko's discovery and led to the arrests of Miyano, Ogura, Minato, and Watanabe. The aftermath of Junko Furuta's case saw her 4 main perpetrators, Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, brought to trial. However, what followed left the public in Japan and around the world outraged and frustrated due to what was seen as extremely lenient sentences for the gravity of their crimes. Here's a detailed breakdown of what happened to each of them. 1. Hiroshi Miyano, now Hiroshi Yokoyama. As the ringleader of the group, Hiroshi Miyano was considered the most responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and eventual death of Junko Furuta. He was 18 years old at the time of the crime, and despite being legally an adult by Japanese standards, he was tried as a juvenile due to laws that allowed for leniency for offenders under the age of 20. This decision alone sparked outrage, as many believed he should have been tried as an adult, given the severity of the crime. Miyano was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence for a juvenile in Japan. However, many felt that this was insufficient considering the horrific nature of the crimes he orchestrated. After serving his 20-year sentence, Miyano was released from prison in 2009. However, his criminal activity did not end there. In January 2013, Miyano was arrested again, this time for fraud. He had allegedly scammed a woman out of millions of yen, though he avoided a significant jail sentence, and the case was eventually settled. Since then, he has changed his surname to Hiroshi Yokoyama in an apparent attempt to avoid the infamy associated with his past, though the shadow of Junko Furuta's case still looms over him. 2. Shinji Minato, formerly Nobuharu Minato. Shinji Minato was 16 years old at the time of the crime, and his family's home was the place where Junko was held captive and tortured for 44 days. His parents and brother, who lived in the house, were reportedly aware of what was happening, but did nothing to intervene. They, too, faced public condemnation for allowing such atrocities to occur under their roof. Minato received an initial sentence of 4 to 6 years in a juvenile detention center. However, after an appeal, his sentence was increased to 5 to 9 years. Like the others, he was treated as a juvenile despite the horrific crimes committed. After serving his sentence, Minato was released, but like Miyano, he found himself in legal trouble again. In 2018, Minato was rearrested for attempted murder after beating a man with a metal rod and slashing his throat. This incident further angered the public, reinforcing the belief that the perpetrators had not been adequately punished and had learned nothing from their time in prison. 3. Joe Ogura. Joe Ogura, who was 17 at the time of the crime, was another one of the main participants in Junko's torture and abuse. He had a reputation for being particularly violent and cruel during her captivity, and like the others, he too received a relatively light sentence. Ogura was sentenced to 8 years in a juvenile detention center. He was released after serving his full term. Ogura's life post-release has been similarly marred by violence and criminal activity. After leaving detention, he reportedly boasted about his involvement in Junko's murder. He continued to live a delinquent lifestyle, associating with gangs and engaging in further criminal acts. At one point, Ogura was arrested again for assaulting a man he believed was dating his girlfriend. In addition to his violent tendencies, reports suggest that Ogura continued to intimidate and harass Junko's family, further adding to the pain and suffering they had to endure. 4. Yasushi Watanabe. Yasushi Watanabe, who was 17 at the time, played a lesser but still significant role in Junko's torture and eventual murder. Like the other perpetrators, he received a lenient sentence compared to the severity of the crimes. Watanabe was sentenced to 3 to 4 years in juvenile detention. His sentence was also extended after an appeal, and he eventually served about 5 to 7 years in total. Watanabe's life after his release has been quieter than the other perpetrators, and less is known about his activities. Unlike Miyano, Ogura, and Minato, Watanabe hasn't been reported to have committed further criminal acts after his release. But the general lack of public information about him has kept him largely out of the spotlight. The lenient sentences handed down to these 4 individuals provoked a national outcry in Japan. Many people, both in Japan and internationally, believed the sentences were far too short given the brutal and prolonged nature of the crime. One major factor contributing to the perceived leniency was Japan's legal system at the time, which had laws in place to protect juvenile offenders, even when the crimes were as severe as those committed against Junko Furuta. The public's reaction to this case sparked conversations about juvenile law reform, with many calling for harsher punishments for serious crimes committed by juveniles. There were also criticisms of the way the media handled the case. Initially, the boys' identities were kept anonymous due to their status as minors. However, several Japanese tabloids eventually revealed their names and personal details, arguing that the severity of their crime warranted public exposure. Junko Furuta's family suffered unimaginable grief and devastation in the aftermath of her murder. Not only did they lose their daughter in such a violent and prolonged manner, but they also had to endure the media circus and the lenient sentences given to her murderers. It's been reported that Junko's mother collapsed during the trial from the sheer emotional weight of hearing the details of her daughter's suffering. After the trials, Junko's family sued the parents of Shinji Minato, arguing that they had been complicit in allowing their home to be used for her captivity. They won a small settlement, but no amount of money could ever ease the pain they endured. The case of Junko Furuta remains one of the most shocking and heartbreaking crimes in modern Japanese history. The cruelty of her captors, the injustice of their light sentences, and the lasting pain it caused her family have left a scar on the public consciousness. Junko's story has lived on, not just as a dark chapter in Japan's history, but as a symbol of the need for better protections, justice for victims, and vigilance against evil. Her name is remembered by many who honor her life, and the unimaginable courage she displayed in the face of such horrific circumstances. Junko Furuta should be remembered not just for her tragic death, but for the life she had, and the light that was stolen from the world. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious. Some true crime cases have a lot of different aspects to consider when diving into them to find out the whole story. This case is one with a particularly sad detail. The killer enlisted the help of two young, vulnerable teenagers. What Dean Corll didn't know was that by doing this, he ultimately sealed his own fate, because one of the boys would be the one to end his killing spree for good. In the early 1970s, the streets of Houston, Texas seemed like the perfect place to grow up. But lurking behind the facade of normalcy was something unspeakably dark, something that would leave the community shaken for decades to come. Between 1970 and 1973, one man, aided by two teenage boys, committed some of the most horrific acts of violence in American history. His name was Dean Corll, but he became better known by a far more chilling title: the Candyman. Dean Corll wasn't what most people would imagine when they think of a serial killer. He worked at his family's candy factory, where he was known to hand out free sweets to local kids. That's where his nickname, the Candyman, came from. Outwardly, he seemed like a friendly, quiet man who cared about children. But what lay beneath was something far more sinister. It all started in 1970. Young boys, mostly teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18, started to disappear. Some were last seen hanging out at Corll's home. Others were simply never seen again after leaving for a friend's house or a quick errand. The boys' disappearances were written off by police as runaways, typical for rebellious teens. But tragically, that couldn't have been further from the truth. To carry out his twisted crimes, Corll didn't act alone. He recruited two teenagers, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks, to help him lure victims. Brooks had been one of Corll's early targets, but instead of becoming another victim, he was coerced into joining Corll's deadly operation. In exchange for money, drugs, and even cars, Brooks would find and bring young boys to Corll. Henley's story was eerily similar. He too was supposed to be a victim, but he convinced Corll to spare his life, eventually becoming an accomplice. What these boys didn't know was that they were helping lead their friends and classmates into the hands of a brutal killer. Once inside Corll's home, the victims were handcuffed, tortured, sexually assaulted, and eventually murdered, either by strangulation or by being shot. But Corll wasn't content to simply kill. He often kept the boys alive, for hours, sometimes days, prolonging their suffering before their inevitable deaths. The bodies of Corll's victims were buried in several locations, but one of the most notorious was a rented boat shed in southwest Houston. This unassuming storage unit became a graveyard, hiding the remains of countless boys who had been lured into Corll's trap. By the time he was finally stopped, 28 victims had been discovered. But the true number? We may never know. Henley, just 15 years old at the time, was struggling to support his family. His father had left without paying child support, his mother wasn't working, and he had 3 younger brothers to care for. While working part-time at a gas station, he met Dean Corll, who offered him $200 for each boy he could bring to a trafficking network. That was a large sum in 1973, and after some hesitation, Henley agreed. The first time he picked up an unidentified hitchhiker. After delivering the boy, Corll told Henley that the trafficking network had murdered him. Corll then manipulated Henley, saying that he was now implicated in the crime and would go to prison if he didn't cooperate. This was how Corll, a predator, controlled those around him. When Henley reflects on killing, he expresses deep horror. He was 16 when Corll ordered him to strangle his first victim, Mark Scott. Henley couldn't muster the strength to do it, so Corll helped him finish the job. Henley, a former Bible reader with aspirations of becoming a minister, thought God would strike him down for what he'd done. When that didn't happen, it shattered his belief system, and Corll exploited this further, constantly criticizing religion to bend Henley into submission. In August 1973, Henley brought two friends to Corll's house for a night of drinking and huffing paint. When they passed out, they woke up to find themselves bound by Corll, who planned to kill them. Corll ordered Henley to undress and assault the girl while he assaulted the boy. Raised by his mother and grandmother to protect women, Henley couldn't do it. The girl pleaded with him, saying, "You're not going to let anything happen to me." At that moment, Henley saw Corll's gun, picked it up, and shot him. Corll had taught Henley to shoot, and Henley fired until Corll was dead. After killing Corll, Henley, in shock, called the police and told them he had shot someone in self-defense. When officers arrived, Henley's chilling confession spilled out. He not only admitted to the murder but also revealed the truth behind years of missing boys. The discovery was almost too horrific to believe. Henley led police to the boat shed where Corll had buried many of his victims. Soon, body after body was unearthed, the true scale of the horror becoming clear. The remains of 28 boys were found, making it one of the most prolific cases of serial murder in U.S. history. Henley and Brooks were arrested and sentenced to life in prison for their roles in the killings. The media dubbed Dean Corll the Candyman, or the Pied Piper. But neither name could truly capture the sheer evil that had been lurking behind the doors of his suburban home. Corll had fooled everyone, his family, his co-workers, his neighbors, but the victims of his sadistic crimes never had a chance. It's been over 50 years since Dean Corll's reign of terror ended, but for the families of the victims, the pain never truly goes away. And while Henley and Brooks sit behind bars, the memory of the Candyman and the lives he destroyed still haunts Houston. This is one of the darkest chapters in Texas history, a reminder that sometimes monsters are hiding in plain sight.
Let me share a disturbing fact with you that might not be that surprising. The United States has by far the largest number of documented serial killers in the world. According to Radford University's Serial Killer Information Center, it has more documented serial killers than the next 10 highest countries on the list combined. So I suppose that would be a reason that a serial killer who was once sentenced to death, only to be released on parole somehow, is a person that I have never heard of until stumbling upon this story while researching video topics. When you live in a country with the highest number of serial killers in the world, I guess some names and stories get lost in the shuffle. Kenneth McDuff, one of the most brutal serial killers in Texas history, began his horrific spree long before he became a notorious name. Raised in Rosebud, Texas, McDuff's upbringing, filled with indulgence from his family and especially his mother, seemed to instill in him a sense of invincibility. But this feeling would eventually come to an end, although much later than it should have. To find out how that happened, let's start at the beginning. On a quiet street in Rosebud, Texas, there stood a modest house on 201 Linden Street. Inside lived Kenneth Allen McDuff. Born in 1946, McDuff was the fifth of 6 children, growing up in a family that gave him far too much freedom. His mother, Addie McDuff, known as Pistol-Packing Mama, was fiercely protective. Her infamous reputation began when she once threatened a school bus driver at gunpoint for kicking McDuff's brother off the bus. From an early age, Kenneth learned that consequences didn't always apply to him, especially with his mother always ready to defend his every action. At Rosebud High School, McDuff had a different reputation, that of a bully. Yet he was smart enough to avoid those who could fight back. After picking a losing fight with a popular athlete, McDuff dropped out of school, choosing instead to work for his father's concrete business. But even this honest labor couldn't tame the violent impulses simmering within him. McDuff's criminal record started with burglaries and smaller offenses, but it didn't take long for his true nature to reveal itself. He'd openly brag about violent acts, including rape and murder, long before he was convicted. At just 18, McDuff already had 12 burglary convictions, but it was the summer of 1966 that would seal his reputation as a monster. On the night of August 6, 1966, McDuff and his accomplice, Roy Dale Green, set out on what McDuff described as looking for a girl. What followed was an act of sheer evil. Spotting 3 teenagers, Robert Brand, his girlfriend Edna Louise Sullivan, and Brand's cousin Mark Dunham, they forced them into a car trunk at gunpoint. After executing Brand and Dunham in cold blood, McDuff proceeded to rape Sullivan before killing her in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. He used a broomstick to strangle her, leaving her body discarded in the bushes. It was an event so horrifying it became known as the Broomstick Murders. Despite the brutality of his crimes, McDuff's death sentence for the 1966 murders was commuted to life in prison when the U.S. Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. It was a decision that would lead to more devastation. Through a mix of legal maneuvers and a tragically lenient parole system in Texas at the time, McDuff found himself back on the streets by 1989. Within days of his release, McDuff is believed to have resumed his killing spree. One of the first victims of this second wave of terror was 29-year-old Seraphia Parker, whose body was found in October of that year. But McDuff wasn't charged for that murder. He managed to avoid immediate suspicion despite a clear pattern of violent behavior. In October 1991, McDuff abducted 37-year-old Brenda Thompson, a sex worker in Waco, and drove her toward certain death. What's terrifying is how close he came to getting caught that very night. Stopping near a police checkpoint, Thompson, bound in the passenger seat, desperately kicked the windshield, trying to signal the officers. McDuff sped away, eluding the police before torturing and killing her. Her body wouldn't be found until 7 years later, in 1998. Just days after Brenda's murder, McDuff killed again, this time 21-year-old Regina Deanne Moore, another sex worker. As McDuff's list of victims grew, so did the brutality of his crimes. In December 1991, McDuff and an accomplice, Alva Hank Worley, abducted 28-year-old Colleen Reed from a car wash in Austin. Reed endured unimaginable horrors before McDuff ended her life. Worley would later confess to raping Reed but denied participating in her murder. McDuff's reign of terror stretched over multiple counties, making it difficult for authorities to connect the dots. But eventually, his carelessness would catch up to him. In 1992, McDuff kidnapped and killed Melissa Northrup, a pregnant convenience store clerk. The hunt for McDuff intensified after her disappearance, and tips from witnesses who saw McDuff at the store helped police close in on him. McDuff fled to Kansas City, Missouri, assuming a new identity and attempting to blend into a new life. But it wasn't long before he was recognized by a coworker who had seen his face on the television show America's Most Wanted. On May 4, 1992, Kenneth McDuff was finally arrested, bringing his murderous spree to an end. In 1993, McDuff was convicted of Melissa Northrup's murder and sentenced to death. But justice didn't come swiftly for the families of his victims. Appeals delayed his execution for years, but on November 17, 1998, Kenneth McDuff was finally executed by lethal injection. McDuff's legacy is one of unthinkable cruelty. His release in 1989, despite the brutality of his earlier crimes, remains one of the most glaring failures of the justice system. But perhaps the most disturbing part of McDuff's story is how many lives might have been saved had he never been given that second chance. His case became a key factor in reshaping Texas's parole system, ensuring that future criminals like him would never walk free again. Before we close McDuff's chapter, it's important to remember those who suffered at his hands. Let's briefly honor the lives of his known victims. Edna Sullivan, a high school student, had dreams of becoming a teacher. She loved reading and spending time with her friends. She volunteered on Sundays to work at the daycare center in her church. Her life was cut tragically short when Macduff abducted and murdered her. Robert Brand, a football player with a bright future ahead, was known for his kindness and loyalty to his friends. He loved playing the guitar. He was killed alongside Edna Sullivan while trying to protect her. Mark Dunham, a fellow student and aspiring engineer, was passionate about technology and hoped to make a difference in the world, and he loved to play the drums. He, too, was senselessly murdered that night. Brenda Thompson, a shy young woman who loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, was one of Macduff's later victims. Her gentle nature made the brutality of her death all the more heart-wrenching. Colleen Reed, a young accountant with a promising career, was abducted from a car wash. She was described by those who knew her as hard-working and kind-hearted. Macduff's cruelty took her from her family far too soon. Regina Moore, 1991. Regina, a sex worker from Waco, was abducted by Macduff and later murdered. Not much is known about her personal life, but her murder was part of Macduff's spree targeting vulnerable women. Valencia Joshua, 1992. Valencia was a 22-year-old student at Texas State Technical College. Macduff abducted her from the parking lot of the campus. Her body was discovered in a gravel pit 2 months later. Friends described Valencia as a bright student with dreams of a better future. Melissa Ann Northrup, 1992. Melissa, a 22-year-old mother of two, was abducted while working at a convenience store in Waco. She was pregnant at the time of her murder. Melissa's family remembered her as a loving and caring individual who had a deep love for her children. These are only a few of the known victims of Kenneth Macduff. It is believed that he murdered at least 14 innocent people, but the actual number of his victims is something we will probably never know. When Macduff was finally scheduled for execution, he ordered a strange last meal: a hamburger, French fries, and a Dr. Pepper. His last words were a defiant, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." On November 17, 1998, Kenneth Macduff was executed by lethal injection, marking the end of one of Texas's most infamous killers. Macduff is also believed to have murdered Cynthia Renee Gonzalez, 23, who was found dead in a creek bed near County Road 313 in heavily wooded terrain 1 mile west of I-35 on September 21, 1991, some 6 days after she was reported missing in Arlington. The body of 31-year-old Seraphia Parker, a known sex worker, was found naked in a field, beaten and strangled on October 14, 1989, in Temple, along the I-35 corridor, a town not far from the prison. Law enforcement strongly believed Macduff to be responsible for her murder, but he wasn't charged with the crime. It is incredibly sad, knowing that if Kenneth had not been paroled, these victims would not have had their lives taken in such horrific, senseless ways. It is shocking to know that the criminal justice system would allow a convicted murderer rapist to go free, especially considering his original sentence for his earlier crimes was the death penalty. Instead of being remorseful and grateful for the second chance at life handed to him upon his parole, Kenneth chose to pick up where he left off. It is believed he started killing almost immediately as the body of Seraphia Parker was found just 3 days after his release. Sometimes I really get into searching the web for interesting and mysterious stories that I haven't heard before. There's something intriguing about a long-standing, unsolved case that always grabs my attention. It does, however, leave me with a feeling of sadness for the victim and those who were personally affected by the case. Welcome to my channel, Weird Wild Stories. My name is Chrissy, and I typically discuss things that are dark, mysterious, and creepy. If that interests you, then please subscribe or follow me. If you enjoy this video, hit the like button, leave me a comment, or share this video with a friend. That really helps out a small channel like mine. Okay, with that being said, let's get into today's story. On May 17, 1968, in the quiet rural landscape of Scott County, Kentucky, a man named Wilbur Riddle was on a peculiar mission. He wasn't hunting for treasure, but for something much more humble: glass insulators discarded by phone workers. What he found that day, however, would haunt not only him but an entire community for decades. It was around 11 a.m., and Riddle had wandered near Eagle Creek, a spot not far from Interstate 75, just north of Georgetown. As he pushed through the brush, something caught his eye: a large, oddly shaped green canvas bag, like one used to roll up a tent. The bag was wrapped tightly with a thin cord and seemed out of place. Intrigued, Riddle wrestled the heavy bundle out of the underbrush. But as he did, the bag rolled down the slight slope, landing by the edge of the creek. He knelt down to open it, expecting to find perhaps some old camping gear. Instead, a foul stench wafted from the bag and a cold wave of dread hit him. Whatever was inside was not something he was prepared to deal with. Panicked, Riddle rushed to the nearest payphone and called the Scott County Sheriff's Office. Within minutes, Sheriff Bobby Vance and his team were at the scene. When they carefully opened the bag, they discovered the badly decomposed body of a young woman. She was nude, except for a strange towel, or so they thought, wrapped around her head. Her body was curled up in a fetal position, her right hand clenched into a fist. She had been dead for at least 2 to 3 weeks. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community. The mystery woman became known as Tent Girl, named after the canvas bag that concealed her. But who was she? And more importantly, who had left her there to die? The investigation began in earnest. An autopsy revealed the Tent Girl was a young Caucasian female, between 16 and 19 years old, standing just over 5 feet tall with reddish-brown hair. No signs of gunshot wounds or trauma were evident, but there were clues. Faint discoloration on her skull suggested she might have been struck and knocked unconscious. The lack of oxygen in the tight confines of the bag likely caused her to suffocate. Despite these grim details, there were no immediate leads. No missing persons reports seemed to match her description. The police were left with a portrait of a girl-next-door type, a generic face that could be almost anyone. A sketch of her was circulated, but it only led to more dead ends. One promising lead involved a missing girl from Maryland, but it turned out she was alive and well in Pennsylvania. Then, a truck driver came forward with an eerie story. He claimed that 2 weeks before the body was found, he had seen a young man and woman hitchhiking along US 25, near where the Tent Girl was discovered. Another witness, a retired heavy equipment operator, said he picked up a similar couple in mid-April, not far from the same spot. The couple argued heatedly in the car, and he eventually dropped them off, watching them head back toward Georgetown. Was this the Tent Girl and her companion? And if so, what happened after they parted ways? The investigation grew colder, even as rumors swirled. One tip led police to believe the towel wrapped around the Tent Girl's head came from a nearby restaurant, but tests revealed it wasn't a towel at all. It was part of a baby's diaper. The clues seemed to slip further from their grasp, and eventually, after months of fruitless searching, the case went cold. The Tent Girl was buried in a local cemetery, her identity still a mystery. But this was not the end of her story. Decades passed, and in 1997, a man named Todd Matthews, son-in-law of the man who had originally found the Tent Girl, became obsessed with solving the case. Using the emerging tool of the internet, Matthews posted about the case in forums and spread the Tent Girl's story far and wide. It wasn't long before he received a message that would break the case wide open. A woman named Rosemary Westbrook reached out to Matthews, saying she had been searching for her sister, Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, who had vanished after visiting family in Florida in December 1967. Barbara's description, a young woman with reddish-brown hair and a gap between her front teeth, was an eerie match for the Tent Girl. In 1998, the Tent Girl's body was exhumed, and DNA from her remains was compared to that of Westbrook's family. On April 22, 1998, the test results came back, and the mystery was finally solved. The Tent Girl was, in fact, Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. Barbara had been living in Lexington, Kentucky, with her husband, Earl Taylor, and their 3 children when she disappeared. Earl, who traveled often for work with carnivals and trucking, had told Barbara's family that she had run away. No missing persons report was ever filed. To this day, Earl Taylor has never been charged with Barbara's murder. The case remains open, but one thing is certain. The Tent Girl, once an unsolved enigma, finally has her name back. But the question remains, what really happened to Barbara? The Tent Girl case, identified in 1998 as Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor, remains unsolved, with no recent updates in 2024. Barbara's body was discovered in 1968 wrapped in canvas near Georgetown, Kentucky, and she was unidentified for decades until Todd Matthews, a citizen sleuth, matched her to a missing persons report posted by her sister in Arkansas. DNA confirmed the identification, but her murder remains unsolved. Her husband, George Earl Taylor, is considered the primary suspect, but had passed away in 1987 before her identification. Todd Matthews' work on the case helped inspire the rise of online sleuthing communities, leading to the founding of NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, and the Doe Network. And so questions remain unanswered. But who knows? Maybe someone out there holds the key to discovering what happened to Barbara all those years ago. Thank you for watching. Be sure to check out the other mysterious stories on this channel. Until next time, stay safe, but stay curious.